Thank you, Chris. Welcome back, everyone, to Talk of the Town. And as we normally do in the first hour of the first Tuesday of every month, we would welcome John Murray in from the Waterbury Observer. This is, of course, the second hour of the first Tuesday of the month, and John graciously agreed to move to the second hour this month. Appreciate that, John.
There's no problem on my end. I don't know how Tom functions at 6 in the morning.
Yeah, there are days where like 10 o'clock rolls around and I'm like, oh,
yeah,
it's like I shouldn't be this tired.
Yeah,
but John has brought again with him Brian Muldoon, and they're going to once again kind of give us an update on this project they've been working on for a number of months here. So, John, take it away.
Thank you so much, Steve. So this has become the once a month for an hour on the first Tuesday of the month. There's a Waterbury Observer radio hour. And when I talked to Tom Shute about trying to do this, I didn't envision that the first 5 shows would all be about the same subject. I thought I'd have different guests, and so as this is just unfolding, started working on a project in January, really intensely about bringing back to life a story that I had worked on with a journalist, Bob Muldoon, all the way back in 1993 in Torrington when we both worked at the Register-Citizen newspaper. And we were collaborating on a story about these young women that were being murdered, and they were Waterbury women, and they were ending up in Harwington in the Campville section along the Naugatuck River. And so Bob and I went out and we were investigating what was going on here, and we went to the streets of Waterbury and spent a night wandering around on Grove Street talking to young women that were sex workers and talking to them about a recent murder. And through unforeseen circumstances, Bob ended up leaving the Register-Citizen before we finished the project, and he actually ended up leaving journalism. And he went off, and during the pandemic in April 2020, Bob's in Boston, and he opened up going through boxes, and he found the story that we had started working on. So he reached out to me, and we agreed to try and move the thing forward. And those 3 murders that we were originally working on in 1993, now in 2021, that's 18 murders. And so within a couple Google searches, Bob, when he found that the folder, in just a few clicks of the keyboard, he found that this intense interview we had with Rika Spinola on Grove Street, that she died on Route 8 18 months later. And so that just really kick-started this thing. So Bob's been coming down. This is the 5th show about this. And Bob's doing a lot of the point work, and I'm guiding and helping, but he's really digging into it. And so I'd like to welcome Bob Muldoon back to Waterbury and back to journalism.
Thanks, John. It's a real pleasure to come to Waterbury. I've grown fond of Waterbury, and I love to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
It was interesting, Bob, last night he was staying in the Courtyard by Marriott, and he brought his bicycle, and he goes on little bicycle rides around the city. And so tell us about your bike ride last night, Bob.
Well, so I went back to where we went that night, 1993, Willow and Grove Street, and it was such a vivid experience. I can some of the images were unforgettable. You mentioned we met a woman named Frederica Spinola. We met 5 women that night. 4 of them gave aliases. They were out on the street doing sex work, so they were naturally fearful of giving their name. But we met one incredible woman who gave us her full name, allowed us to take a picture. And I dare say, John, we wouldn't be here right now if she hadn't done that. I mean, having one person step forward and identify herself fearlessly and have a photo, that when I found all the old notes, she really galvanized this project for us. And then when we found that she had died, I mean, she had almost predicted her death that night. She said, I had it in my notes, I got me a habit and I'm going to die on these streets. And what we learned as we talked to these women is that drugs was the common denominator. One woman said to us, her name, she wouldn't give her real name, she called herself Linda. She said, any woman out here who says that she's doing this for groceries or the rent is lying, and we found that to be the case.
Yes. So as we started digging into this project, and just to get us up to speed a little bit, so anyone who hadn't heard the first few shows, is that the list just kept expanding. And so we were at first focused, this was the Campville section of Harwington. In 1993, there was 3 women. And so now that number ended up being 6 women. And the 18 was sort of a sprawling number that we started looking at what happened from ground zero, from Grove and Willow. And so we're looking at Waterbury women. Not all of them were involved in the sex trade that ended up murdered, but several of them ended up on railroad tracks along Thomaston Avenue. One was bludgeoned to death in a building on Linden Street. So there was a variety of circumstances, and we included that led us to building this list of 18. 3 were victims of the most prolific serial killer in Connecticut history, William Devon Howell, who picked up 3 women on Grove Street and kidnapped them and murdered them, and he's been convicted of that. But we have, out of that 18, we have 10 unsolved right now, and some of them are just kind of mysterious circumstances. And one that we just recently we're about to publish a story about her is very interesting. It's the story of Marie Thrasher. So just take us through that, and let's use this as an example about the circumstances involved in these murders.
Yeah, in 1990, a worker at lunch in downtown Waterbury near Bank Street saw a body in the Naugatuck River, and the body was decomposed. Police started investigating. They initially said this appears to be a homicide. They had no idea who it was, who it was.
The body was decomposed.
Yeah, they couldn't even identify the gender or the race. But the police had a hunch. Well, there was a ring on Marie Thrasher's finger, or this victim's finger. That ended up being a key piece of the puzzle. They showed that ring. They suspected it might have been a woman who was a sex worker. They showed that ring to other sex workers, and they got a name. And they also, once the autopsy came, they got a height and race and age, and that fit the profile of Marie Thrasher. So she had just come out of Niantic prison 6 months earlier, so the police got medical and dental records from the prison and were able to identify her based on the dental records.
So this is where this investigation and several other investigations takes kind of a weird twist for both you and I, who are curious and pondering. So here's now she's identified, Marie Thrasher. The medical examiner comes back with the report that they identified that she was a black woman, so they got the race and the sex, and then they identified her through the dental records. But the medical examiner at first, it was inconclusive. The first thing that we've seen, the medical examiner couldn't identify the cause of death, but with further results pending. The Waterbury Police Department says that and we haven't seen this report yet, but that it was a drug overdose that killed her, and so maybe it took a little while further to do toxicology reports, and so then immediately, okay, so if she died of a drug overdose, how'd she get in the river? That's just a screaming question. Is like, I mean, she's not fly fishing in the river. It's so if she did do a drug overdose, who physically then threw her body into the river? So there's to both of us is like, that's not a closed case. So it's like, that's very suspicious. Like what happened here? And so you found, and through your reporting, you found that this is not an isolated conclusion.
Yeah, and even the medical examiner hedged her bets. And I say that in terms of determining what the cause of death was. The last line in the autopsy report was, this victim, Marie Thrasher, possibly died of an overdose and was, quote, put in the river. So that phrase, put in the river, hangs above this whole determination of an overdose. And that question has never been answered. Who put Marie Thrasher in the river? Why was Marie Thrasher put in the river? Yes, there was an indication of drug use. And
prostitution.
There was a prostitution arrest, and that's why she was in Niantic prison. But put in the river, that is hanging over.
That's a pretty loud question right there, and that's not an isolated case. And so we have two other circumstances of women that the cases are not considered open right now, and we're probing them as best as we can, trying to get the police records. There is D.D. Rodriguez and
Sean May Haskell.
Yes, so both of them are found on the train tracks. It looks like their bodies discarded. Two police officers I talked to, Captain Michael Ponzillo and Deputy Chief John Napiello, I talked to them about D.D. Rodriguez, and both of them, they responded to that scene. They were detectives on the scene. They're detectives on the scene, and they said, this is a murder scene. They were treating it like a murder scene. And Chris Corbett's reported in some of the reports that we have obtained, saying they're going to treat it as a homicide. And then the results come back that it's a drug overdose, and it seems to be case closed. And so, and Sean Marie Haskell she's on the train tracks. And so who's putting D.D. Rodriguez and Sean Marie Haskell, and who's putting Marie Thrasher in the river, and who's putting these other two young ladies on the train tracks? And to have them all categorized as drug overdoses, that doesn't make any sense to either one of us. It's like, and the two Waterbury detectives I talked to, they were scratching their head. That doesn't make sense. They were shocked at the medical examiner, but then I don't know whether you just keep going anyway. I don't know what the protocol inside the police department, how they handle that. That it's like, but it's case closed. So, and now in some of your reporting, Bob, is like you've probed and spent dozens and dozens of hours on the internet researching murders, and we're finding that sex workers / prostitutes there's a rash of these murders all across the country. So tell us a little bit about what you found.
I mean, you can almost any place where there are an area of some town or city where women are doing sex work, there has almost always been a rash of unexplained killers. In Seattle, there was this fiend named Gary Ridgway, who was the Green River Killer, who admitted to killing 49 women.
49?
And did so gleefully. I mean, it's sickening to read his statements about it. In other cities like New Bedford, Massachusetts, there are about 10 unsolved murders of sex workers. In Long Island, there's someone dubbed the Long Island serial killer. There's 4 unexplained, unsolved murders from 2009. In Denver, in Chicago, there's 50 women that were strangled. I mean, you can rattle these off of, unfortunately, off your tongue, and just think of names like John Wayne Gacy. I mean, he was killing young boys, and Dahmer. Just so many of these tragic cases.
We're going to take a break in a minute, but there was a statistic that you shared with me the other day that just shocked me, and so it was about the risk that young women and men are taking doing accepting work on the streets for pay for sexual in exchange for sexual favors. That what is the risk? So there was a number that you came back with. Share that with us.
Yeah, being a sex worker increases the likelihood of your being murdered 200 times the average person. So it's a high-risk lifestyle. And Ridgway, the Green River killer who killed 49 women, sex workers, called them the perfect victims. They're transient. They use aliases. Most homicides, it's someone you know who does it. But here someone's entering the car of a stranger with no connection. And if you've got a diabolical fiend, then it's hard to solve a death like that. And
so we'll explore more about the variables of working the streets, why it makes sex workers perfect victims, as soon as we come back from this break.
Welcome back to Talk of the Town, as we are joined once a month on the first Tuesday of the month by John Murray for the Waterbury Observer Hour. So, John, back to you, sir.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm here with journalist Bob Muldoon. We're continuing to work on this. Really, it's the largest project the Observer has ever worked on. I've been very involved in certain cases and certain investigations, the Smolinski investigation or the Palumba case, but this one now involves 18 women and murders, missing people, drug overdoses, mysterious drug overdoses, mysterious circumstances of someone tumbling out of a van near the killing grounds up there in Campville. It's pretty intense. It's sprawling, and the names just keep growing. And Bob found a few more. We haven't plunged into those yet, but it's going back a little bit earlier into the 80s. So, and some of these names, people have reached out to us and said, "What about this person? What about that person?" And then we put them to the list and start putting them through the litmus test of. And one of the problems that we're having, and we're getting some pretty solid cooperation from the Waterbury Police Department now, but we filing FOI, Freedom of Information requests, trying to get the police reports from these deaths so that we can piece this stuff together, and it's been very difficult. The state police, we're now over a year of waiting, and we've been told it could be another 6 months or so before we get the results of that, and a lot of it could be redacted. We're not sure exactly what we're going to get, and the Waterbury police are starting to dig into their files, and I think it's a real problem, and a nod to them is that they are investing man hours and going back, and Captain Mike Ponzillo with one of the cases involved the details of a bond, like when was a bond, what day and time was a bond issued, and they had an old system back in the 80s where it was they'd take out a book and write, Bob Muldoon taken out for $10,000, and who took Bob Muldoon out. And so this was a critical piece of the information that we're trying to link to this murder or a suspect that someone had given us their name. And so we tried to find this book. And so at first it's like, I'm talking to Chief Fred Spagnola and Captain Ponzillo, the head of the Detective Bureau. And so they committed, Captain Ponzillo himself, I think, got involved in looking for this bond book, and he found it. It was in storage. He found the book and found that little piece of information, and ultimately it wasn't the piece of information that just put the hammer onto a nail and just that this was elevating the guy to bright spotlight on this individual as a suspect. But the Waterbury Police has been working with us and providing reports and which is the only way we're going to get at this. And so we're trying to find pictures of some of these young women, and we're having difficulty. Many of them had arrests, so there was mug shots. But it's an archaic system of mug shots. That's hard copy mug shots stored someplace. And with all the things going on in Waterbury currently, with it's the Wild West on the streets with drugs and gangs and murders, and here's John and Bob woodpeckers tapping at the police asking for these reports, but they're listening and they're helping us. So back to what we were talking about before we took the break, Bob, is so these 18 women, not all of them were sex workers. A few of them weren't, but most of them were, and most of them had a drug problem. So in some of your investigation and some of your readings, what is it that makes the sex workers so vulnerable and such easy, perfect targets, not just in Waterbury, all across this country? What are some of the variables that you found?
They're easy to target. It doesn't require planning. So if you have a predator, all he has to do is go to an area where sex is trafficked on the street, negotiate a price through a car window, and he's got a woman in his car. The majority, a high percentage of serial killers have a sexual relationship of some sort. Some sex is part of the impulse to kill for these types of monsters. So rolling down a car window with a vulnerable woman who's probably out there for drugs, negotiating a price to give her money, you now have someone in your car, and you're going to head to a secret area. So when police are trying to solve murders, they usually look to the person next to you, maybe a relative, a friend, a spouse, a boyfriend. Well, you've got this mysterious stranger that the woman has never met before, likely. It's hard to track where they go once they're in the car. The woman often will use an alias out of a sense of shame. So police basically, and all of a sudden, a body turns up far away from an area where the woman was picked up. Often the women are estranged from their family, living a transient lifestyle. They don't have a 6-month rent with security deposit. Maybe they do, but the money to fuel the drug habit is the whole focus of their life, to feed that habit. And that Achilles heel makes them extremely vulnerable, and it makes it extremely difficult to solve cases without clues.
So some of the women that, as we've plumbed around their stories, one that we were finding, you found yesterday in the archives of the Republican American, is Dee Dee Rodriguez, that it's not even an open case right now. We posted something. We posted a video on the Observer Facebook page last night, and one of her cousins reached out and said, and we didn't even talk about her in the video, and said, my cousin was murdered. So inside the family, they're viewing that as a murder. Yet no one's investigating it. It's not even a cold case. It's a closed case.
They're calling it an overdose, the police.
An overdose.
Found on the railroad tracks.
Yeah, so the family is believing that she was murdered. You and I would think that, and even the two detectives thought that this was a murder. There's some confusion with a lot of this stuff, but Dee Dee Rodriguez, when we were looking into, I was reading her obituary last night when we were meeting at the courtyard, and she had 8 children. So she's a mother of 8. Mildred Alvarado, mother of 4. The woman that was murdered by William Devon Howell, that was, she was, I'll just find this, Mary Jane Menard. She is a substance abuse counselor in Waterbury, and we haven't really dug into her story yet because the 3, Melanie Camellini and Marilyn Gonzalez and Mary Jane Menard, they were all picked up on Grove Street by William Devon Howell, kidnapped and murdered and buried in New Britain. So those cases are closed, but they all came from this killing ground of this epicenter of. So anyone in Greater Waterbury, if you say where's the prostitutes working, it's Grove Street. That's it's synonymous with this. And some of these women, I think Melanie Ruth Camellini, she was from Seymour, and so she came to Waterbury to work the streets in Waterbury because here's where the men were. But Mary Jane Menard was married, a substance abuse counselor, had children, had seemingly a successful life, and now we hear the power of opioids with the Sackler family and dentists and CEOs and high-powered people get hooked on this stuff, and then you just lose your mind. You have to chase this, and so she was chasing that. She's out on the streets for maybe a handful of times, and she encounters William Devon Howell, a serial killer, and she's dead. So she's not a broken, shattered woman. She's a fully functioning woman that intersected these opioids, and it just took her. It took her, made her vulnerable, brought her to the streets. So a lot of these stories, they're just very compelling when we start to dig into who the women were. Children, you've done some beautiful reporting, really bringing some of the individuals to life. Karen Everett didn't have children, but she certainly would have. She was young and attractive and smart, and so we're getting sort of pulled in emotionally as well. It's become very personal. Is at first the only one that we had any connection with was Frederica Spinola, who I had this beautiful, haunting photograph of her on Grove Street when we were interviewing her in 1993. She's the only real name we had. And then when we started to, our original intent was let's just publish that story from 1993. And you had it all done, and here's Frederica Spinola. and I was a little paralyzed, as thinking now it's been almost 30 years. Where's Frederica Spinola now? It's like she could be a grandmother in Waterbury and had a successful life and just had this dark period of her life. And now here's her picture in the Observer, a flashback from literally 28 years ago. And so we were sensitive. We reached out to the family. But it's been kind of a haunting experience of going and digging into these lives, and there's many more to go. We still don't have all this, and it's been a very emotional experience for you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it started off, we actually met Frederica Spinola. We talked to her for 15 minutes. She was very charismatic. One of the you meet thousands of people in your life, and people come and go, but she was unforgettable. She was honest. She was brutally honest, brutally candid, but charismatic. And then when we found out that she died 18 months later, ejected from a vehicle at 50 miles an hour, very close to Campville, and then run over, it affected us,
Well, there's stories about like Jessica Muskus, is like we had her name, but we didn't really, and we had her family. It's like we had seen her family on social media, and we reached out to her sister, and we're trying to get her friends to talk, and so we were trying to bring Jessica Muskus and bring her into focus about her life. She had a beautiful daughter, Destiny, and through social media, we ended up connecting with her best friend. We ended up connecting with, you interviewed the daughter, and the family. Her sister, Nicole, was justifiably very hesitant to talk to the press, because the press had just basically smeared Jessica immediately, prostitute, drug addict, and they just hammered that point home. And the family was pushing back on that as an unfair description. And so it took a while to get Nicole to trust us, and it ended up being a very positive experience for the story, and a very positive experience for Nicole, as she was ultimately moved by what you produced. But there's many other cases. Like, so here's Marie Thrasher, that we've just kind of recently put the story together about Marie Thrasher. Are there Thrashers out there that, or her friends, who knew Marie Thrasher? Who knew Dee Dee Rodriguez? Who knew Sean Haskell? We had the story about Mary Jo Markowitz, that you wrote a beautiful story equating her to Waterbury's Eleanor Rigby, because nobody really, there was no response. It was to her death. But she had a husband who was incarcerated, right? Now, we've tried to reach out to the husband. The husband hasn't responded, understandably. This is very sensitive stuff, and reaching out, because we're reaching into embers of pain and some of the most horrific moments in a family's life. And now it's 30 years later, and here comes John and Bob poking the embers and trying to bring some of this stuff back to life. But what I think we found is that universally these families want justice. They're grieving to this day. It's unanswered questions, and just the whole thing about Dee Dee Rodriguez, that it's a closed case. It's an overdose, and here's family members saying it's a murder, and we believe and the detectives thought it was a murder, and that just is left undone. So what's it been like for you reaching out to the families?
It's heartbreaking. The women are so often were just smeared with words that become to define them to the public and the press, drug addict, sex worker, prostitute. But in talking to the families, there's so much more. I mean, Karen Everett loved equestrian. We have a photo with her on her horse Banner. Jessica Muscus was a talented artist and won Best Dressed in middle school in Waterbury, and was in a gifted program. So you see we learned about Marie Thrasher in looking at the autopsy report. She lost a child to in a crib. An infant died suddenly.
And she was 19 years old.
19 years old. Maybe that set her off on a path of trying to numb pain and got into drugs. But you see...
And you reported that she had sought mental health counseling about grief. How do you ever get over the death of a baby like that? That would break anybody.
I mean, one thing I was thinking about, these women they were in maybe turbulent periods of their lives where maybe they had gotten into drugs, but they never got the chance to get out of that turbulence. There are so many, drugs grab you by the throat, and it's a tough battle to beat, but people do, thousands of people do. But these women never had that chance to get out of the grip of drugs and become that grandmother that we hoped that Frederica would be. And when we found her picture, we thought, we don't want to write this story. She might be a 65-year-old grandmother with kids all around her. Maybe she overcame those difficulties. Well, I mean, when we found out that she was ejected from a vehicle 18 months later, well, she never had a chance to get out and set her life straight. And all of these women dying at ages like 22, 24, 25. I mean, the oldest might have been 40. Dee Dee Rodriguez was 36. So they never had the chance to win that battle. Some killer snuffed their lives out, and so often these fiends like Howell and Ridgway, these serial killers, they show such contempt for their victims, like they were no good, they stole money, I hate prostitutes. Yet these fiends are the most narcissistic and despicable. I mean, you read about them in prison, and they weep if the judges, if the guards take away their privilege to have crackers smeared with marshmallow. Howell is in Cheshire prison now, and there was a book about him, and he weeps when they don't let him watch the women's gymnastics on the Olympics, and he weeps when he can't make little chocolate cookies for himself. Yet he's absolutely unremorseful about killing 7 women in Connecticut, saying they would have stolen. I saved other people from them stealing money from them, or they deserved to die. Yet he weeps over his own hangnail. It's disgusting to read.
Well, that's putting it mildly. One of the aspects of all this, too, is that trying to go back into 1988 and trying to breathe some life into these investigations, that some of the critical details that we're after is that these things are who were the workers on Grove and Willow Street back in the 80s and 90s that are alive today that have. So we have developed a handful of suspects. Neither one of us believes this is one serial killer doing this, because one serial killer has already been convicted. Another guy's been convicted of one of these murders. So we already have 2 convicted murderers. But someone who knows a lot of the women who worked on the streets back in the 80s and 90s and knows them well, said to me that many of them died of AIDS back then, and the ones that made it and that grew into adulthood and beat their addiction, like we're talking about if Rika had become a grandmother. My source sent me this text, said, because we're trying to show pictures and get the women to help us out, and said nobody wants to help out with the girls because they don't want their secrets to come out. The things we did when we were young and stupid, which I did a lot of young and stupid things, or stupid things when I was young. I still do stupid things. The things we did when we were young and stupid, our kids and grandkids, neighbors and bosses don't know about. Now as adults, most of the streets, the women are past the drugs and are a productive part of society and would rather their past stay their past. And that's an angle of all this project that we have to sort of walk around delicately, is that some boyfriends, some husbands, some ex-husbands, this was just this horrific chapter of their life filled with grief and pain, and we're knocking on their door, asking them to relive it, and they're not really they're not responding. So we continue to try and reach out to the public. The public has helped us with tips, with leads, with names. So the Waterbury Observer is about to, our reporting to this date is about to, I'm trying to get my arms around it in the next 10 or 14 days and put it into print in the Observer. So that'll have a whole different impact, because we've been posting these things on the Facebook Bulletin, a project that I'm working on, and so a lot of this is through social media. So the Waterbury Observer is still in print. It's doing a lot of work online. Bob Muldoon is going to continue coming down here and reporting, and we're going to keep at this, and we implore the community to stay engaged and to send us tips, and we're going to, some of it is we're trying to find photographs of, a photograph of Marie Thrasher when she was young and happy, photograph of Dee Dee Rodriguez, besides the fuzzy black and white in her obituary. So we want to share stories about these women, and we hopefully are bringing light to this situation and imploring the police to look at some of these again. And so I thank you, Bob, for coming down here, and I thank you for returning to journalism with emotion and passion and determination. And you're really making a difference in this situation. And thank you, Steve, and this is over and out from the Waterbury Observer.
Thank you, John. Really fascinating. Looking forward to hearing more about this next month.
Thanks, Steve.